Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. Our guest is Kilian Kleinschmidt, who is the head of one of the world's largest refugee camps between the years of 2013 and 2014, the Zaatari camp in Jordan. Kilian, thanks so much for joining us. Start out with just giving us a description of Zaatari and what it was like when you were there.
Well, it was impressive. I was asked to take over the coordination, the management of this camp back in 2013, and all what I knew was 100,000 plus people. It's a camp, so all camps in the world I thought looked the same, and I was sent there to fix a problem.
What was the problem?
The problem was daily violence. It was something the media called actually the hellhole of humanitarian aid, and it was certainly not a very pleasant place. It was extremely rough when it came to the people themselves. There were high levels of mistrust amongst the refugees from Syria, 100,000 plus Syrians. But I also had lots of grudges against the aid workers, against the Jordanian authorities in charge of the camp. So we had daily violence with demonstrations, throwing rocks, throwing tent poles after us like spears. We had people injured, we had people frightened, not wanting to go into the camp to work because it was really unpleasant. And yes, I found a tent city, about, I would say, 25,000 families at the time. And yeah, well, it worked somewhat because the supplies, the keeping people alive, that worked very well. But at the same time, something didn't work, which was clearly the level of understanding between the refugees, the Jordanian authorities, and the aid community. There was something which didn't correspond what they were expecting.
And you spent decades in refugee camps in other countries. Is that different? Is that any different in Zaatari than it would be at a refugee camp in Somalia or somewhere else?
No, it is not. And I think what was different there was, first of all, the camp was very visible. Anybody came to visit the camp, from Secretary John Kerry to...
There's a lot of media that has gone to Zaatari.
Media, politicians, delegations of all sorts, thousands of visitors, because it was very easy to see, and it was really the only place where you can actually touch and feel and smell the Syrian...
But you were used to dealing with the types of tensions that you were describing.
Yeah, you would find it in many places, but the Syrians were also very vocal, and they were very outspoken really about this in terms of saying, why are you treating us this way? We, first of all, we expect from the international community more than just aid, which is something to satisfy your guilt, quote unquote, because you're not intervening in Syria at the time, 2013.
So they felt that bitterness.
There was a real bitterness. They said, how can you spend only $500,000 on us a day in this camp, whilst you should be sending missiles into Damascus? That was sort of what they told John Kerry.
Because they wanted to go home?
They wanted to see the dictator defeated, they wanted to go home, but they knew very well going home wasn't really possible because of bombings and war and so on. So they said, you need to end this, basically what you helped to start. That was one. And then the other one was, and that's sort of the dimension where people like me and the teams could actually change something, is the whole conception of what is a place where you put 100,000 people? Is that a storage facility? Is it a logistic challenge? Or is it also something where you create opportunities for people, you create perspectives, you allow people to thrive? You don't see it only as a place of doom and gloom.
I'm guessing that you're going with the latter argument, that it should be a place of opportunity as opposed to a storage facility for human beings.
If you look into the history of migration, of forced migration, of desperate migration, as we begin to call it as well, if you move out of poverty, of extreme poverty, it's being a refugee as well in a form. Yeah. And here, in history, we have always seen that people who moved also changed sometimes for let's call it, the better. But they had access to other impulses in their life. So we don't need to look at displacement and exile only as something negative. We should turn it around and say, well, there is also an opportunity for people to see something else, to experience something else, to learn something else. And for an example, in Za'atari camp, once we had moved on and actually established a dialogue with the people on the same level, eye to eye, instead of from above. Aid is very arrogant. It's coming as almost like the sort of colonial point of,
let me help you.
I help you, little poor thing, and I'm good and I'm strong and I know how it works. Once we had fixed that, we also moved ahead with more opportunities. So, for instance, in a Zaatari camp, about 250 girls are playing soccer today. They would never play soccer in southern Syria in a little village. About 100 or so have been learning Taekwondo. Others are now involved in learning skills which they would not at any point learn back in a rural community in southern Syria, where most people came from. So that's what we need to understand. People change in exile, but instead of having that as a negative change of even a moment of potential radicalization, a potential sort of frustration, exclusion, which in fact a camp, if you deal with this as a camp, or any situation where people don't have full access to opportunities and rights and a future, so that change of paradigm we have to introduce. And
is that a change of paradigm? I mean, these places are intended to be temporary, right? They're tent cities. They're not supposed to be there forever. If you change the paradigm to one in which people actually have potentially more opportunities in a refugee camp than they would than from the places they've come from, does it make people not want to ever leave? And so is that controversial?
Well, it is controversial because, again, I think, I don't want to accuse, but I want to say that currently we're selling the suffering of people. There are crises all over the world as we speak, with lots of people affected by wars, by extreme poverty, by earthquakes, or strong rains, especially now in times of climate change. We see that more and more happening. And there's only a very small amount of money available for all of this. $20 billion a year is what is available for emergency humanitarian support. That's all, worldwide. That's a joke. And so there's a high competition between different situations, between crisis situations. One sells better than the other one for strategic reasons or because there's more visibility. And how you achieve visibility is with images of suffering. Aid agencies receive money, they're also in competition amongst each other, receive money on the basis of attention. They don't receive money and then work with this in order to work in the long haul and really try to change it. It's about the suffering, which is the number one sales point, and that's what needs to change.
And so they have a disincentive to improve suffering because it means they will then get less funding?
That would be sort of the extreme, this extreme accusation, but what I'm also saying is we associate with the issues of refugees something negative. The term refugee is a status.
Right.
But it's a status, it's a legal status if you want. You're protected because you have fled persecution and a situation. But it doesn't change anything of you being a human being. So you're the same human being as you and me. In all of us, there is somewhat a bit of a refugee.
It's quite profound, though, what you're suggesting, that somehow there is a system in place for refugees to sort of keep their standard of living and keep their opportunities tamped down so that aid agencies can continue to exist. It seems to undermine the exact point of aid.
First of all, there are different elements to this. I mean, one, again, is because the narrative is wrong. The narrative is they're victims and they have to be assisted forever until they go home, in this case. I think they don't want to be assisted forever. They want to be in charge of themselves. So we need to change that as well. We changed that narrative in a Zaatari camp in saying, well, people should be able to pay for what the services they receive. They should be able to make decisions. There should actually be quote-unquote mainstreamed into what everybody in Jordan, in this case, would experience in his life. Also, let's take the Jordan case. 100,000 refugees are in the camp, and 500,000 refugees are not in the camp.
Right.
Which is very important to understand. Only a small portion of people live in camps, usually in the world, because camps, being quite inhuman in a way, as they have been managed. So people don't want to be there, and why should people in a camp be treated in a better way than people who are outside, who pay bills, who have to survive, who quite often don't get really aid in this sense. So there's one, changing the narrative, changing the way of how we look at that, at such situations. The second one, yes, I mean, aid agencies need somehow to survive. They will all tell you, and it's, I believe it's true, that they would like to see something more long-term happening. But again, here probably what the mistake is to say, oh, the emergency agencies should be replaced by long-term development agencies. Why are not going to be replaced by a normal setting of stronger municipal services? If you have municipalities which have received a lot of refugees, why not by the private sector to do more? But we have that logic of one aid agency has to be replaced by another one. And I think this is fundamentally wrong. This is not how the world works and functions. You and me, we are not assisted by aid agencies. We are working on, and living in places where there are municipal services, there's the private sector, public sector, and there's a sort of a play also with the civil society. This is how anybody needs to live. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're a refugee, a migrant, whatever stamp has been put on you in terms of a category.
What does that mean as far as what you wanted Zaatari to become? Did you want it to become sort of a city of sorts where people didn't have that sense of displacement and there was more permanency to their lives? What would that look like?
Well, I mean, what we try to move on, and it's again, changing the way of how you see and look at the place. They looked at it anyway as a city, as a living space.
They did.
Yes, we looked at it as a storage facility, and the Jordanian government certainly as well. Now, where shall this go? It's not a question of what we want or not, it's a fact. It had become a city. But applying humanitarian standards, applying different ways of managing a place like this, which don't correspond to the needs of a city, that's where it becomes problematic. So what I wanted was to replace the humanitarian logic by a normal city logic, which would have been much more sustainable. I wasn't saying we're creating here a city for the next 1,000 years. What I'm saying is we create a space which is managed, whenever 100,000 people live together, has to be managed absolutely according to an urban logic.
And part of that logic for you has been about technology and about innovation. So talk about some of the ideas that you had that could have improved lives at low cost or in ways that the aid agencies could have actually used to make people's lives better.
There are two elements. One is, again, use the know-how we have. How you distribute water, how you manage water, how you set up infrastructure. So that's one part. In that, of course, we know today, we're having smart cities today. Why smart city concepts cannot be applied to refugee settings. We have the Internet of Things, which could easily be adapted to also poorer environments. Internet of Things doesn't belong only to the rich, it can also belong to the poor. So, for instance, one big issue we had in the camp was, well, parents had to do something and couldn't leave the kids alone, because when they left the kids alone, there were dangers for the kids, such as tent fires in the beginning or so. I mean, you could have easily in warning systems in a neighborhood, you could have communication connectivity between different homes. Technology, when it comes to also access to the aid, was, for instance, a major changer in the Za'atari camp, because what is very inhuman is when people have to queue up to get something they don't want.
Like what?
Like food. I mean, we all have different tastes. We all dress differently. We all have different requirements in our daily lives. And here is somebody like me who decides what they eat, how they dress, how they live.
And you have to line up.
And you have to line up. Every 2 weeks you collect some food which you really hate, when you have to eat the same stuff for months and months and years, we decided you have to go to the toilet together. We decided you have to clean the toilets together. We decided you have to cook together. So that's all sort of decisions which are made on your behalf. We can change that. So when the World Food Program changed from food aid, where people had to queue up, to supermarkets where people could go and shop and make decisions, limited decisions of how much they would get for their $1 a day. This is what it costs to feed somebody there. That was changing from an aid charity recipient with, I would say, lack of dignity to a happy shopper.
That's what it comes down to, is what it sounds like you're saying. It comes down to how do you preserve human dignity and also agency, you know, that sense of I can make choices.
And people there made these choices themselves because they wouldn't wait for us to set up the supermarkets, which took about 2.5 years to set up. But they were setting up their own shops. They invested 3,000 shops in that camp today. With nobody really knows how much monthly turnover. We think it's about $15 million, which changes hands in this camp every month.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
And they brought in all the things, all the commodities we wouldn't distribute. So where they were selling their aid goods for cheap money, so there was also some form of a mafia coming up. And on the other hand, bought things which made their homes different.
Right.
Different curtains, different colors. For Syrians, it's very important to set up a fountain at home where you sit and you have a cup of tea and you have a bird cage and you have plants. That was
Can you describe that a little bit more? Describe the dwelling in a refugee camp where there would be a fountain and a bird cage.
So see, I mean, we are putting, that's the principle. We look at 100,000 people. So we divide 100,000 people by 5. That's the number of tents or living containers, whatever you call it, you have to issue. We will put them in rows.
Okay.
What they did, they didn't stay in rows for 5 minutes. They changed them. They put them together. When they got these basically containers, they cut them into pieces, built something else out of this. They built shops, they built different homes, inner yards. They made sure it became very personal. The right to individualism, I called it as well. People really wanted to be different. They wanted to be different from the neighbor. They wanted to say, come and see my home. And there in that, for the Syrian, we even found people building a fountain out of little stones and cement and so on in the very early days when they just had a tent. So they put tents around, had the fountain just to sit there and have their cup of tea. Later they built their home with prefab parts and elements and so on. But the first part was somewhere where I say, this is where I sit, that's me. It's me and myself, and I'm different from my neighbor.
That seems like a natural human instinct. Also, I think the instinct maybe to work. And so what were most of these people, what are they doing for work?
Well,
what are their opportunities?
Unfortunately, again, Jordan, like most refugee hosting countries in the world, do not allow refugees to work because there's something special here. So certainly don't become too comfortable. Although again, that's wrong. I mean, strong people will make strong decisions and will make strong decisions to return when they can, and will also invest back in their home country. So that is also one of the paradigms we have to change. Invest in people, make them as strong as you can so they will contribute to your economy, and also, of course, be stronger when their country or their region or whatever becomes again livable. That's one part. But yes, they cannot work, and so people had a problem of access to organized work. So what happened was, like everywhere else, as they were fabricating their new homes, didn't listen to us, messed up the entire planning of the place, and designed it in the way of how they did. They needed plumbers. They needed to steal the electricity, so they needed 250 electricians to do that. So what that meant as well was basically setting up electricity companies, selling the connections.
Right.
This is what they did.
So there would be sort of these black markets everywhere.
There were black markets because that's not part of the aid system. So they were kind of busy, and the whole day drove us crazy because they stole everything, what was communal facilities. They dismantled 85 buildings. Up to the last, some of them were done out of blocks, cement blocks, concrete blocks. Up to the foundation, everything was taken because again, who wants a communal toilet? So they built private toilets.
How did you deal with that? You were someone described you as the mayor of Zaatari. How did you deal with those issues while you were there?
Well, I was also compared in one article as a mix between Bruce Willis and a bulldozer or something. I had to be quite strong in terms of saying this is yes, this is no. I had to be more macho than macho, and it's a very male-dominated society as well. So it was very important to first of all, of course, understand different visions and bring them together. And I remember that very strong moment when 3 little boys had perished in a fire, and
at the camp.
At the camp, and people were very annoyed, and they overrun our place with angry men throwing stones, hitting us, and so on.
Wow.
And then somehow we managed to cool them down, have a discussion, and then we had a discussion on what should this place look like. How do we manage services? How do we manage the space? How do we manage everything together? And suddenly they said, look, if only part of this we can change, we will not throw stones and rocks at you anymore. We will, that was a bit exaggerated, shower you with flowers. And then we agreed we had to plant the flowers first.
Yeah.
And yes, the result was we started moving and setting up kitchen gardens. And when I left back in 2014, I must say one of my worst enemies from before was planting little flowers in front of my office container. So that was...
So you were sort of showered with flowers in some way.
Well, we all showered each other with flowers. I mean, the point was to change that whole concept of, well, it's a horrible place into as a lively, bubbly living space.
So you're talking about sort of the systemic difficulties and the incentives that aid agencies have to change. I think Bono wrote in an editorial recently in the New York Times that there should be sort of a new Marshall Plan to address these issues. Is that what it's going to take? And do you see that the richer, more industrialized countries are going in that direction? Because the last I read, the UN was saying they have like 40% of what they need to address aid even for Syrian refugees.
Yeah, but again, I think we have to move away from that logic, you just give more and so on. It's a greater responsible for all states. I'm glad that I will be very soon involved also with the German government in shaping the, let's say, a new concept of aid. And so there's a lot of rethinking of how we actually work on not preventing conflict. It will always be conflict. Yes, we have to do more about climate change. We have to do more about, of course, extreme poverty. After all, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're saying in 15 years nobody will be poor anymore. But so it's not going through this logic, or we just give more money. It has also to go through a logic of new, different partnerships. It has to go through the logic of saying, in fact, the world has an answer to everything already. We have answers to energy problems. We have answers to how to clean up water. We have answers to medical issues, and we're improving them all the time. Well, some will say it's maybe too scary at times, the technologies we have already, but what is happening, unfortunately, is it's not moving there where it should be used most. If I look at Jordan again, which has such a burden of so many more people, it has no water. I mean, it has no drinkable water, but it has the Red Sea, and it could have very easily desalination to water its deserts. It could have enough water for everyone to live off. Right now, we're talking about eventually the whole Middle East going to dry up into an extent that it will come to more conflict and so on. So why not investing into
technology?
Water, into technology?
Right. And a lot of these technologies you talk about, and you've talked about 3D printing and perhaps using that to produce prosthetics in refugee camps, they're cost efficient as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, let's use the connectivity we have. It's not anymore sort of the doctor who has to save lives and traveling from New York to southern India and does some surgery there or so. Telemedicine is today very easy. You have connectivity in many places.
So there's all these tools that are working in different places, and I guess your vision is to sort of use them globally Is that what sort of your new venture
That's what
is?
we're trying to do. We call that switchboard, basically a switchboard between what the world can do and where there would be opportunities, let's call it opportunities, not needs, opportunities to use the know-how. Whether it's good old engineering capacity, management know-how, any skills, or whether it's top-notch technology, which really is a game changer, it doesn't matter. But what is happening right now is only known to a very small portion of the world. So let's dig this all out, make it visible. That's what the brain in the middle, that brain, we call it switchboard, needs to find and makes it available. Why we call it switchboard? Because it needs to still connect. We don't function only by virtual connectivity. We also function because we have human relations. So we say we need an operator who connects and makes sure that there is a communication, and that if somebody has invented something in, let's say, sits in Kenya, has invented a process, can move that with our help, if you want, with the help of that switchboard, move that to northern Iraq. Or northern Iraq moves an invention back to Germany or something. But that connection, that's what needs to take place.
Kilian Kleinschmidt, thank you so much. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Great.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.